The story begins at dusk when an officers, one of those sworn to protect and serve, was patrolling the neighborhood as usual. No one could have foreseen that this ordinary evening on duty would turn tragic. Out of the dark alley came a man with a cold, fierce stare, full of hatred, his face twisted with rage, and a barely perceptible whisper turned into a scream filled with the venom of racism. The attack was immediate, brutal, and so personal that it seemed every blow was an expression of his deep-seated hatred. This case was more than just an attack. It revealed all the undercurrents of racial intolerance and aggression hidden in our society. Stories like this show that hatred can break through even shoulder straps and oaths, and that no one is immune to hatred. We really appreciate you, our viewers, and your thoughts are important to us. Please write in the comments where you are watching us from and help us spread these important stories to make a difference in the world together. Dusk had fallen smoothly over the city, flooding the streets with a soft, seemingly subdued light. The officers knew these neighborhoods seemingly by heart. Every nook, every familiar silhouette of a building was a familiar part of his night patrol. At first, nothing seemed disturbing. Everything seemed calm and even somehow ordinary. It was his usual routine route, but this night he felt a strange tension, barely perceptible, like a shadow running behind him. Maybe it was just a play of light and darkness, but the feeling of an invisible observer remained and grew stronger by the minute. The officers glanced around the street, trying to figure out where the feeling was coming from. That invisible chill down his spine that pierced him suddenly, but was firmly rooted inside. He mentally dismissed the feeling. For how many times during his years of service had he thought danger lurked in every corner? And how many times had it turned out to be just a play of imagination? But tonight was different. This evening breathed in oppressive silence, an undercurrent of menace, as if the city were hiding something from his view. And at that moment, he wanted to turn around, not just to look around the street, but to look more closely, as if he sensed that someone was there, in the shadows, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. Silence enveloped the streets in a dense blanket, absorbing even slight rustles. The officers walked along the deserted road, listening to the sounds that usually fill the evening life of the city. But on this night, everything seemed ominous, alien, as if the city around him was frozen in anticipation, holding its breath. He couldn't understand what it was that was bothering him, but the oppressive feeling wouldn't let go, making every step heavy, as if something invisible were restraining his body and mind. As he passed a narrow alleyway, he suddenly felt as if someone were looking at him from the darkness. The unpleasant sensation of someone else's gaze was almost palpable, as if they were looking at him not merely with interest or curiosity, but with a kind of invisible contempt, with a cruel determination, like a predator waiting for the right moment to attack. The night itself seemed soaked with aggression, breathing from every shadow and surging with waves of dark energy from which it was impossible to hide. Subscribe to Deeple Pro to edit this document. Visit www.deeple.com /Pro for more information. At that moment, the officers saw him. A figure slipped out of the darkness like a shadow, but a living shadow, moving with a lingering, frightening certainty. A man with a heavy, skewed look of rage was walking straight toward him, clenching his fists. It was not just anger written on his face, but something far more frightening and personal, a genuine disgust, a contempt that didn't even try to hide. The officers tensed as he met the man's gaze. He had seen such looks before, but he had not expected to meet them here. This evening, in the line of duty, the stranger looked at him as if he were not a human being, but the embodiment of something he hated with all his soul. He was looking at him as if he were not a man, but the embodiment of something he hated with all his soul. A sinister whisper came from the man's lips, distinctly this time, as the caustic, venomous words flew into the officer's face. They were not mere insults. They were words of hatred for his color, for his position, for his very essence. Each word felt like it was hitting his mind, awakening bitterness and pain that he tried not to show. The man did not hold back, his racist insults breaking the silence of the night, echoing through the deserted street like a curse from which there was no escape. The officers were stunned, unable to believe that someone could feel such rage for no reason, simply because of his skin color. He felt a protest boiling in his chest, but immediately realized that the man in front of him was a violent, aggressive, and vicious man. The officer stood as if stuck to the ground in front of the stranger, feeling the cold fear gradually stiffening his body. This man was not just aggressive, there was something deeper in his gaze, something completely unconcealed, terrifyingly sincere. There was a primal hatred in his gaze that made him feel that his dignity, his life, and his very being meant nothing to his attacker. There was an angry determination in the man's eyes, as if he had finally found what he had been looking for so long, a man on whom he could take out all his accumulated anger and contempt. The alley, which usually seemed like a normal part of the evening route, suddenly became crowded and hostile, as if narrowing around them. The light from the street lamp cut them off from the rest of the world, leaving only darkness and an oppressive silence where there was no one to come to their aid. Every muscle in the officer's body tensed, and he braced himself inwardly for a possible attack, though his mind still clung to the hope that this was all a mistake, that the man was about to turn and walk away. But suddenly the stranger stepped forward, and with every movement the officers felt a wave of icy fear mixed with bitterness and resentment. The man looked at him as if he were an enemy, as if he were someone he despised, someone he did not think worthy even to stand before him. It was as if someone had pulled down the curtain that hid the true face of hatred. The stranger leaned a little closer, and his voice, a half whisper, filled that gloomy alley, turning it into a place where the air was electrified with racist venom. "You think you mean anything here?" he sneered, a grin of vile contempt that was so palpable it made you want to step back just to avoid breathing the air. "You are nothing but your face, your skin color, your uniform." The words sounded like blows, each more painful than the last. They crashed into the officer's mind, shattering his composure, awakening his anger, but at the same time evoking a deep, tense sense of hopelessness. It was as if his life and his place in this world could be reduced to a few insulting words, to the scorn of a man he had never seen before. But before the officers could respond, the man lunged forward, leaving no time to react. His hands came at the officers with a fury that seemed to penetrate deeper than just the body. They went to the very soul, causing pain that neither physical strength nor calmness could dull. Each blow was like a confirmation of the hatred that had been hidden for years and now burst out with such force that the alley seemed to narrow even more, as if the night itself had become part of this attack. The man who emerged from the darkness seemed the embodiment of hatred itself, his every step imbued with contempt and malice, his figure barely recognizable in the semi-darkness, drew near, and with every movement he made it became clear to the officers that this was no mere passerby. The stranger was walking straight toward him, his gaze flaming with disgust, as if he saw before him not a human being, but something unworthy of existence. The officers tried to remain calm, but something about the man's grim, almost painfully focused gaze, the way he clenched his fists, the way his face twisted evoked an instinctive fear. The man finally stopped right in front of him, too close, violating personal space and forcing him to take half a step back. The officers could feel the cold, hard stare on him, as if the stranger wanted to burn through him, to see him shiver under the onslaught of hatred. "You must be proud of your badge." "Huh?" The man gritted his teeth, staring at him in disgust, as if seeing only the shape, the color of his skin, and nothing else. Every word was imbued with caustic malice, and the officers felt a chill run down his spine at the sight. It was as if the stranger was deliberately increasing the tension, as if he was taking pleasure in the fear he was trying to arouse. It was more than hostility. It was deep-seated hatred, a malice that had grown over the years and now surged outward like an avalanche, unstoppable and dangerous. "You think you're allowed to do anything, don't you?" he continued without waiting for an answer, his voice ringing in the silence, echoing in the deserted alley. "You think your badge makes you something? You're just dirt I have to wipe away." At these words, the officers were seized with both indignation and a deep, pinching pain. All that he represented, his duty, his desire to protect and help, all this meant nothing to this man. He was humiliated, despised simply because of his skin color, his service, his uniform. Yet nothing could diminish the aggression coming from the stranger. Every word was like a poisonous blade penetrating the deepest layers of his mind, leaving wounds that would not heal. and before the officers could say anything or even recover from his rage and pain, a stranger lunged at him with unexpected force. The first blow was so swift and brutal that the officers could barely stay on his feet. The man brought his fist down upon him with a furious fury, and in each blow, he felt the full force of his accumulated hatred, all the bitterness and malice he held within himself, waiting for the right moment. The officers tried to raise his hands to defend himself, but each new blow was even stronger, even harder, as if the stranger was determined to destroy him not only physically, but also mentally, to break his will. In the eyes of the attacker, the officers saw such rage, such burning hatred, that he became truly afraid for his life. The officers tried to meet the stranger's gaze, gathering his remaining strength and determination, but met with an icy, hateful expression that literally paralyzed him. There was something inhuman in the eyes of the man who glared at him from the dark alley, as if he looked at him not as a human being, but as an object of contempt and hatred, unworthy even of life itself. The gaze pierced the officers, leaving behind a cold residue, like a silent accusation, as if he were already condemned by his very existence. Every time the officers tried to raise his eyes and meet that heavy, cruel gaze, he felt his own courage slipping away, as if an invisible force were consuming his confidence. The stranger seemed possessed, his face frowning in a grimace full of hatred, deeply rooted and ready to burst forth. It seemed that every word, every insult he whispered had been suffered. Each was an echo of the way he perceived the world, filled with hatred and contempt for anyone who didn't conform to his dark, ugly beliefs. "You don't even deserve to stand here," he hissed, with such anger that the words stabbed like sharp blades. "How dare you defend this city? How dare you even be here when there are so many like you around? You're dirt, and I'm going to fix that." The stranger's words chilled his heart, plunging the officers into a state of complete terror and helplessness. A protest was rising inside him, a desire to confront this man, but with each word, with each new burst of aggression, it became more and more difficult to fight. It seemed to him that the whole world had suddenly become darker. The ominous feeling that he was alone with the embodiment of evil came over him in a heavy wave. He saw in the stranger's eyes all the cruelty that he had stored up in himself for years, all the unbridled hatred that he was now unrelentingly unleashing upon the officers. As the stranger stepped toward him again, the officers instinctively stepped back, his mind flickering with thoughts of escape, of trying to escape, or at least finding a way to call for help. But the alley was empty, and the whole world seemed to disappear beyond that oppressive, evil-soaked shadow. The officers realized that to the stranger, he was more than a stranger, he was an enemy, a symbol of everything he hated. In his attacker's eyes, they saw a hatred that went beyond the two of them, encompassing anyone who was in any way different from him. As the man took another step forward, the officers noticed how his eyes, full of rage, seemed to flare even more, reflecting a hatred that knew no limits. It wasn't just anger, it was a destructive force coming from the darkest corners of his soul. The stranger's eyes burned with implacable anger, and that look sent a chill through the officer's body, as if all the warmth had left him, leaving only anxiety and numbness. Gathering his strength, the officers tried to say something to quiet him, but barely opened his mouth before the man interrupted him with a sharp, jagged shout. "You don't even know who you are. You don't deserve this uniform. You don't deserve respect. You don't deserve to stand here and pretend to be a protector." The words came like hail, and with each new insult, it became more and more difficult for the officers to remain calm. He was accustomed not to react to provocation, but this torrent of hatred was different. It had no boundaries and seemed to be purposeful. In straight at his heart, he felt bitterness rise in his chest, mixed with horror and resentment. These words were not just words, they were an accusation, a poisoned spear aimed at his very essence. His right to be human? All you know how to do is hide behind your uniform. The man continued, clenching his fists so white his knuckles turned white. "But you're not an officer's. You're nothing. You're just dirt. How can you claim the right to serve this city?" His every word was imbued with a hard, venomous contempt. It seemed to the officers that it was not just one man, but all the hatred, all the malice that this man could muster. He stood there, almost out of breath, not knowing how to react, how to cope with this wave of insults and anger that came at him again and again. He wanted to answer, to try to explain that his duty did not depend on the color of his skin or his shape, but something stopped him. He realized that to this man his words would be nothing but empty sound. In the man's eyes, he was not a person. He was not someone to understand or talk to. He was the embodiment of everything the man hated. It was as if each insult encouraged him to tremble, to doubt himself, to doubt his right to be here and do his duty. But something inside the officers would not let him get into this hatred. Deep down he felt rage and bitterness, but it would not allow himself to show weakness. He was afraid, he was in pain, but he knew that he had to stand his ground and, in spite of everything, hold himself together. But his calmness only fueled the stranger's rage. The men stepped even closer, their faces so close that the officers could feel the attacker's heavy, ragged breathing. It was the breath of a man whose hatred was out of control, whose rage had turned into a desire to break and destroy. "You don't know how much I despise you and your kind," he breathed contemptuously. Ed, his eyes flashed with dark fire. "You will never be like us, never deserve to be respected, and I will show you that." And before the officers could realize what was being said, the man raised his hand sharply and dealt him a crushing blow. The blow struck the officer suddenly, like a bolt of lightning, and he was barely able to stay on his feet, feeling a sharp, throbbing pain. At that moment, a short sigh escaped from his chest, and he felt all his confidence shaken as if shattered by that first crushing blow. A man stood before him, breathing heavily and noisily, and a dark, ominous fire blazed in his eyes. It wasn't just a physical blow. It was targeted destruction in an attempt to break him, to humiliate him, to make him feel helpless, weak, insignificant. Suddenly, a scream burst from the man's throat, a hoarse scream filled with anger and contempt, a scream that pierced the silence like a thunderclap. The cry was directed at the whole world, but in it were clearly audible racist insults, full of a vicious venom that it could no longer contain. The words sounded fierce, aggressive. Every syllable was soaked with hatred and contempt, leaving no chance for a peaceful resolution. "You think you're somebody here," the man yelled, his voice echoing through the alley like waves of darkness slamming into everything around him. "You're nothing. You are filth. Ed, you have no place among us." Each insult cut into the officer's mind like a dagger. The words cut deeper than any physical blow, tearing him from the inside out, making him feel as if he were alone against an entire world filled with hate. The man wasn't just insulting him, he was trying to humiliate him, to erase him, to strip him of his humanity, to reduce his whole life to one thing, that he wasn't worthy of respect, or the right to stand here in this uniform, or the right to be a part of this world. The attacker's words awakened mixed feelings in the officer's: fear, anger, despair. He tried to keep his composure, but the harsh, hateful shouting gripped him deeper than he recognized. He felt his own patience thinning under this onslaught. Each were leaving an invisible scar on him. But the man did not stop. He shouted again and again, his voice hoarse but still fierce in the silence of the night. "Do you think your uniform means something? That your life means something? You are nothing. Do you hear me? You're nothing." The officers could barely stand on his feet, his heart thudding and his ears ringing with this torrent of hatred. It seemed to him that every scream of his attacker was destroying him from within, draining his strength and leaving him disarmed and devastated. This wasn't just a physical fight, it was an attack on his soul, on his essence, and it left him no chance to defend himself. He could not answer. His attacker's words were hitting too hard to parry. He felt the air constrict around him, a deafening, inescapable fear rising from somewhere in the depths of his soul. Fear that he might not be able to stand it, that this rage would consume him, leaving only bitterness and emptiness. And suddenly, before the officers could gather his thoughts, the man sprang forward. Ed, everything around him frowsy. There was something animal, primitive in that spurt, as if he were not a man, but the embodiment of uncontrollable rage. The first blow came straight to his chest, so hard and sharp that the officer's breath caught. The world shook, and he felt the ground beneath his feet as if it had gone out from under him. It wasn't just a fight, not just an outburst of aggression. The men attacked with cold, focused brutality, with each blow plunging the officers into a deafening pain that grew in his chest like fire. The officers tried to instinctively defend himself by raising his arms, but a new blow with incredible force landed on his shoulder, and he realized that each blow was imbued with personal hatred, directed directly at him. The attacker's anger was inexplicably burning, and each new blow struck the officer's ego and dignity like a red-hot iron. His consciousness suddenly began to fog. He seemed to lose the sense of time and place. Each blow was like a verdict. With every cell he felt the contempt of this man, his absolute certainty that the officers was unworthy not only of the uniform, but of life itself. "You just stirred underfoot," shouted the man, his voice breaking into a hysterical croak. And in every word there was mad anger. "You're all like that. You think you can do anything. Because you wear a uniform, you don't deserve anything." The words were filled with venomous contempt, and the officers felt as if they were tearing him from the inside like shards of glass, each insult seeming to hit him directly in the heart, causing a painful resonance that made him barely able to stand. Fury boiled up inside him, an answering wave of indignation, but it was swallowed up by fear, despair, helplessness. As he tried to pull himself together, he felt his own body begin to fail him. It felt as if his muscles refused to obey, that every movement was a dull ache. His breathing was coming in and out, and his eyes were starting to blur. But he forced himself to hold on, because he knew that if he fell, this rage would only grow more intense, without mercy. The officers felt his pride and strength leaving him, but he would not let himself give up. He saw the man strike each blow with fury, his face twisted with hatred and contempt for anyone who was even slightly different from him. Each new blow was stronger than the last. Each time he felt the pain creeping deeper and deeper, and he found it harder and harder to hold himself back, to remain steadfast. Officers felt that his own faith in justice, in the right to protect, was beginning to crumble under the onslaught of this hatred, which came upon him with terrible force. Each blow now seemed not just physical, but a deep, personal attack on the officers himself, on his very essence, on what he considered his duty and right. These blows were not random or spontaneous. They were aimed not only at his body, but at his identity, his belonging to something greater. He felt all his convictions, all his loyalty to duty, crumble before this wall of rage, ended him with such malice that he couldn't understand how anyone could ever live with such hatred in their hearts. The man was not just insulting him as a policeman. He was humiliating him as a human being, as a person, as a member of society who could be an equal among others. He saw in him not just an officers, but the personification of what this man hated with all his soul. His every movement, every gesture, was full of intent to make him feel insignificant, helpless. "You never understand what it's like to be human," the man continued, his words as sharp as his fists. "You never understand what it's like to be someone you hate. You're nothing to me." The officers was on edge. The blows continued, and each one seemed deeper and more humiliating than the last. Pain coursed through his body, making him scream, but he restrained himself. He knew that if he fell now, if he showed weakness, this man would win, and perhaps that victory would be far worse for him than the physical trauma. This victory would be a victory of hatred, a victory that the man standing before him could destroy everything he had ever known about himself. And in this moment, between the blows and the humiliation, the officer sensed how this incident went beyond a normal fight. This was not just physical violence, it was an attack on the very nature of things, on the very idea of equality, on everyone's right to be respected. This man, swinging his fists, was trying to destroy more than just his body. He was trying to destroy himself. His mind was spinning with thoughts of injustice, of how terrible it is when hatred becomes an instrument of destruction, and how difficult it is to fight such a rage that knows no barriers. The officers felt his body weakening, his strength leaving him, but his mind could not allow itself to give up. He felt pain, not only physical pain, but also moral pain. Pain of knowing that even in this terrible situation, he was part of something much bigger, something he couldn't control. And in that moment, despite the gravity of what was happening, the officers felt that this attack was not just violating his body, but breaking his inner self. With each new blow, the officers felt his own rage, suppressed and hidden, began to awaken. He was accustomed to controlling his emotions, especially while on duty. But now, in this gloomy alley, his patience had reached its limit. Mixed feelings, fear, pain, and humiliation were building up in him, turning into a barely contained wave of anger. He felt cornered, helpless against this mad hatred that seemed inexhaustible, like a black abyss. His attacker seemed to feel that he had broken him, that he had humiliated and crushed him, enough to make him lose control. There was a triumph in his eyes, a pleasure in another man's pain that only fueled a new wave of cruelty in him. This man enjoyed seeing before him not just an officers, but a broken man, frightened and abused. It was as if he felt that every blow he threw was a way of expressing all the hatred he had long stored up inside. "That's it. That's what you deserve," he hissed with a nasty grin, savoring the moment when his fist met the officer's body again. "You think you can be superior to us? You think your uniform makes you worthy? You mean nothing. You have never been and never will be our equal." These words, full of contempt and hatred, cut deeper than any blow, causing in the officers a barely restrained desire to answer. But what could he say? What could he do against this powerful, almost animalistic rage that was slamming into him from all sides? He felt every cell in his body resisting this humiliation, his mind screaming at the injustice, at the fact that no one deserves such hatred just because of skin color or uniform. However, deep inside, the officers realized that this was exactly what his attacker was trying to do. He was trying to destroy him, to make him lose control, to break him not only physically but also mentally. It was an attack on his dignity, on his right to be equal among all others, and it brought this man pleasure. The officers understood that it was a hatred that demanded a sacrifice, demanded that he shake, that he surrender, that he become someone who could be broken finally. But he knew that if he gave in now, he would let this hatred win, let this man destroy not only him, but everything he stood for, everything he believed in. And in that moment, despite all the pain, despite the humiliation, he felt that he could not let this man win. The officers, clinging to his last strength, raised his eyes and looked directly into his attacker's face. There was no more fear in his gaze, only a steady, deep determination, a reminder that he was not just a victim. He saw that his attacker noticed this change, and for a moment his face frowsy, surprise flashing in his eyes as if he realized that despite everything, the officers was not broken. This irritated him even more, and he rushed forward again, but this time his blows did not bring the same triumph. The attacker began to feel that he was facing a man who, in spite of humiliation and pain, retained his dignity. The officer struggled to hold on, but his strength left him with each blow. Pain throbbed throughout his body, and his mind was racked with a helplessness he had never experienced before. He tried to resist this man, to maintain his dignity and strength, but his body was no longer obeying him, bearing traces of the rage with which he had been overwhelmed and humiliated. He felt that not only his physical condition, but also his will, his inner core, was gradually crumbling under the onslaught of this rage and hatred. Each new blow, each insult sounded like an accusation, like a curse, as if he were guilty of something terrible by his mere existence. This man seemed not only to want to inflict pain, but he wanted the officers to feel the full weight of his hatred, to absorb it, to feel guilty, as if his whole life had been a mistake. The officers could not understand where such cruelty came from, why there was so much dark, twisted satisfaction in this man for his pain. "You are nothing, you and your kind," his attacker hissed, his voice filled with pure, icy contempt. "You deserve nothing but to be humiliated and broken. You think anyone in this town will stand up for you? You think anyone cares about people like you?" These words cut harder than any feast, as if every insult uttered was a brand that would remain forever. The officers felt his soul literally bleeding, his attacker's every word destroying what he believed in, who he believed in. Images of family, friends, all those who respected him, who appreciated him for what he was, for his job, for his hardships, surfaced in his thoughts. He realized that this man was trying to erase all those images, to leave him with only pain and a sense of his own worthlessness. It was incredibly difficult to keep hope alive when he was facing a man who seemed ready to destroy him entirely for the pleasure of this cruel and unfair victory. The helplessness overwhelmed him more and more, and he felt his willpower thinning with each passing second, as if leaving him alone with the pain and humiliation. But even in this state, in this moment of utter weakness and despair, there remained something in him that refused to be broken, that stubbornly resisted total annihilation. He realized that it was important for his attacker not just to win, but to defeat him completely, to destroy his spirit. And it was this desire of his adversary, this malicious intent, that, like a fire, kindled in him a spark of resistance. Every word, every insult that the attacker shouted was as if torn from the very depths of his hatred and prejudice. The officers listened as his opponent lashed out with more racist slurs, allowing himself to openly vent all the hatred it seemed to have been saving up for years. This was no longer just an attack on his person or position. It was an open attack on his background, his culture, everything that was part of his life. "You think you're like us," growled his attacker, his face contorting with each new word, as if he were feeding on his own contempt. "You will never be like us. You are a mistake that must be corrected." These words, imbued with venomous contempt, deeply wounded the officers. He felt as if they were tearing him from within, awakening a bitter, almost paralyzing sense of alienation, as if he were separated from all society, as if his existence were a breach of order, a mistake that others could only despise. It wasn't just resentment, it was more than that, a sense that it was facing a man for whom he and all those like him should not exist at all. Rage and pain mixed inside him, rising like a wave ready to break through. But he suppressed the feeling, holding himself back with all his might. The officers knew that in this situation, even if he responded, even if he tried to object, it would not change the attitude of the attacker. This man was not here to hear his words or understand his point of view. He was here to humiliate, to make him feel like a stranger in his own city, a stranger in his own life. "You're a nobody," the attacker said, and his voice was not just contempt, but deep, heartless conviction. "People like you should be kept away, kept under control. You think you can be an equal among us? You just don't get it." These words tore at him from the inside, each one like a blow, robbing him of his footing, as if he himself, his work, his personality could be reduced to something base, something that deserved neither respect nor dignity. It seemed to the officers that he was no longer just defending himself, but was defending something more, his right to be part of society, his right to dignity, to respect. And despite all the physical pain, despite the rage and humiliation, he knew he must not let this man destroy him completely. There was still that spark inside him that told him he was stronger than this hatred. The officers felt his strength waning, but a desperate determination awoke in him, a survival instinct that drowned out the pain and gave him a powerful impulse to fight on. It seemed to him that he was on the verge of extinction, that if he gave up now, he would finally lose his identity, his right to be himself. He realized that this moment was a fight not only for his physical survival, but for everything he had defended every day of his service. The attacker, seeing that the officers was still holding on, became even more furious, his blows more and more brutal and focused, as if he wanted to break him once and for all. "A man," shouted hoarsely, his words laced with insults and curses, escalating every second and creating an atmosphere of complete hatred around him. "Do you really think you can make a difference here?" the attacker shouted, his voice cracking with anger. "I won't let you stand on equal footing with us. No one will let you be. Here, you and your kind are not worthy." Those words penetrated his very soul, but the officers realized that something strong was igniting inside him, something he could not even imagine at that moment, a firm and unyielding sense of dignity. He knew he couldn't let this man defeat his spirit, break him completely, even though his body was scarred and weakened. He knew he had to endure, if only for the sake of his honor and his belief in justice. Every word of his attacker was a reminder that he stood on the front lines not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced such hatred, for all those who have once been tried to suppress, humiliate, and make him feel insignificant. In that moment, the fight became more than just a defense against physical violence. It was a defense of his human right to be himself, to stay true to his principles despite this unreasonable, animalistic anger. Gritting his teeth, he gathered his last strength, raised his arms in a weak but determined attempt to defend himself. His body screamed in pain, but he knew he had no right to fall, that he had to stand in front of this man, even if it was his last effort. His gaze became hard and unwavering, and he realized that this determination was perhaps stronger than anything his attacker could oppose him with. The attacker paused for a moment, seeing that his victim did not give up, that she remained herself despite all the humiliation. Something like doubt or even fear flashed in the attacker's eyes as he realized that his rage could not break that inner core. At the moment when the officer was barely on his feet, holding back the last remnants of his strength, there was a sound of footsteps in the alley. It was like an echo, faint but piercing, for he no longer believed that anyone would come to his aid. On the verge of despair, he turned his head and saw his fellow officers rushing toward him, their faces reflecting a mixture of anxiety and determination. That sight seemed to be his lifeline, a reminder that he was not alone, that there were those who would support him even in his darkest moments. The attacker frowned, his face contorted as he realized he had lost control of the situation. His gaze instantly changed from fury to wariness, as if he had not expected such a turn, did not believe that the officers he had humiliated and broken could get help and support. Assailant backed away, realizing that his absolute power was no longer in this alley. Did you think you were alone? That there was no one to support you? The attacker shouted, but his voice was already shaking in a desperate attempt to hold on to what was left of his control. He tried to utter another insult, but he could already feel his grip on the situation crumbling, his rage no longer as strong as before. The officers raised his head with difficulty, and there was no longer any fear or confusion in his gaze. His eyes now reflected a pride, resistance, and determination that his colleagues could only admire. He realized that his resilience was not just a personal achievement, but a symbol of their entire service, their unity and commitment to each other. The officers felt the surge of strength that came with the presence of those who shared this duty with him. Stood beside him not because of a uniform, but because of a shared belief in justice. His colleagues, surrounding the assailant, looked at him with the cold contempt with which they often look at those who infringe on their brother. Their associate, one of the officers, a friend he had worked with for many years, supported him by the shoulder, helping him up. This simple gesture was filled with such powerful support that the officers felt his strength returning, though the pain still stunned his body. The attacker, seeing this unification, this strength that needed no words to show its power, began to retreat. There was no more confidence in his eyes, only confusion and fear. He had no choice but to take a step back, realizing that his hatred no longer had power over this man he was trying to humiliate and break. After apprehending the attacker, the officer stood surrounded by his colleagues, and a sense of reality gradually returned to him. His body was still throbbing with pain, every muscle aching and fresh wounds bleeding, but stronger than the physical pain was another feeling, bitterness mixed with fatigue and the realization that this incident had uncovered something deep-rooted, far more serious than just a personal attack. As the story spread across the city, the officers began to realize how much publicity it had generated. News of the incident, of how racist hatred spilled over into a brutal attack, shocked the public. People began to talk about the problems that had remained in the shadows for years, about the hatred that, as it turned out, could affect anyone, regardless of position, appearance, or merit. The officers felt not just like a victim, but perhaps someone who had forced others to look into dark corners that many preferred to ignore. His inner protest against injustice, which had been bubbling up in his soul during the attack, was now becoming part of the public discourse. People began to think about the underlying hatred that appeared not to have disappeared or been defeated, but only lurked in the shadows. Many people expressed support for him. Letters and messages came in, and in each of them, there was something personal, something that showed how the incident had touched others as well. People shared their stories, their fears, and the pain they kept inside them. The officers realized that for many, his story was a reflection of what they felt themselves but could not express. But with the support came a sense of heaviness. He realized that many now looked at him as a man who had faced open hatred and remained standing. Although inside him the bitterness of the humiliation he had suffered still burned, the officers felt that his personal ordeal had become a symbol of a larger struggle, a struggle for which he had not been prepared, but in which he now seemed to have found his place. This heaviness did not leave him, as it went over and over again the words full of hatred and humiliation that the attacker had shouted. He realized that those words were not just the words of one man, but something much deeper, something that touched society, that affected everyone. After that incident and the ensuing public outcry, the officers was invited to a meeting with his superiors to discuss what had happened and his feelings. He stood in the office feeling vulnerable, as if he was naked in front of his colleagues and superiors, as everyone in the room knew the details of his humiliation and heard the words that were directed at him. His body still bore the marks of the attack, but even stronger was the emotional pain that wouldn't go away. The chief looked at him carefully and seemed to be trying to understand how this incident had affected his subordinate, not only as an employee but also as a human being. After a short pause, as if choosing his words, he said, "We realize that something terrible has happened and that this was not just an assault on an officers. We all feel that it hit at the very heart of what we're protecting, but I want to hear it from you. How do you feel after everything?" The officers was silent for a few seconds, gathering his thoughts. He realized that this was his chance to say everything that had accumulated inside, but the words did not come as easily as he would have liked. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was hoarse, as if it were physically painful. It wasn't just an attack. He began slowly, searching for words that would convey the depth of his feelings. It was something personal. I wasn't just a victim of violence. I came face to face with hatred, with something that was trying to destroy me, not only physically but also mentally. I felt that that man saw in me not just an officer's, but everything he despised, everything he thought was wrong. His colleagues in the room listened in complete silence, and the officers could see that his words did not leave them indifferent. Many of them had never encountered such hatred, such blatant racism directed directly at them. For them, it was a case on the edge of the imaginary, but now it had become real and frightening. "It was hard on me," he went on, a note of bitterness in his voice. Hard not just because of the blows, but because every gesture he made, every word he said, was aimed at making me nothing. I felt this hatred deeper than physical aggression. It was hitting my soul, my right to be a part of this society. He wanted me to doubt my place among you, among those I had always considered my own. His superior nodded silently, and the officers noticed that there was a subtle sadness in the eyes of many of his colleagues, a realization that hatred in this society could touch everyone, that no one was immune to it. "I don't know if I can forget it," the officer said, his voice trembling, but he continued, "But I do know one thing. If we all turn away, if we pretend it was just an accident, we leave the door open to more horror. We have to make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who will be here after us." These words were not only his personal pain, but a challenge to everyone in the room. The officers felt that this was not only his personal conversation, it was the beginning of something bigger, something that could be a turning point in their work and in their community. A few days after the fateful conversation with his superiors, the officers was invited for an interview with journalists to discuss what had happened. He realized that his words could send an important message to others, that they could inspire and support those who had faced similar hatred. But at the same time, he realized that he would have to revisit those painful moments, relive every word, every insult he heard that night. He knew that his story would reveal underlying issues that many people prefer to keep silent about, but the public interest demanded the truth, an honest look at racism and hatred. When the journalist asked the first question, the officer's voice trembled slightly, but he quickly gained confidence. It was not easy for him to remember this moment over and over again, but he realized that he had to do it for the sake of those who had also been subjected to injustice. "I think the worst thing about what happened," he began, "was not the physical pain. Yes, it was hard to deal with the blows, but it was even harder to face the hatred directed at my identity, at who I am. Being an officer is my job, my mission, but in that moment it became a target for something deeper, something that is rooted in our society." His words sounded heavy and honest, and there was silence in the room. The journalist listened with genuine attention, and the camera silently recorded his every gesture, every expression on his face. The officers felt that his story was piercing this audience, and he decided to go further, to open up those thoughts that are usually left unspoken. "I never realized that hatred could be so strong," he continued, his voice tinged with deep bitterness. "Every blow, every insult, every word was aimed at making me feel like an outsider in this world. and making me question my right to wear the uniform and be a part of this society. It wasn't just aggression, it was an attempt to erase me, to reduce everything I do and who I am to nothing. The journalist, trying to be delicate, asked a question about the reasons for hatred. He wanted to understand where such violent, almost pathological hatred could come from, and why someone would dare to act so cruelly. The officers understood that the answer to this question was not simple, but he realized that people needed to hear his honest opinion. Racism is a disease, he replied, his voice full of hardness and pain. It is not just an opinion or a prejudice. It is a destructive force that lives in the heart. It poisons the soul and turns people into monsters. When you see a person not as a person but as a symbol of something you don't like, hatred becomes uncontrollable. You lose your humanity. This man saw me not as a person, but as an image, a symbol of everything he despises, and because of that he allowed himself to hurt me. His words were like a blow. They resonated in the room, awakening the realization that the fight against hatred and prejudice is not just an individual struggle, but a common task for society. The officers realized that his story could be the beginning of change. That perhaps, after this interview, someone would reflect. Someone might see in themselves or others the hidden, painful shadow that fuels hatred. The officers finished the interview, realizing that this was only the first step toward healing, toward the possibility that his wounds and those of the community might someday heal. It was hard for him, but he knew that his story was no longer his alone, that it had become part of a common conversation, part of the struggle for a world free of hate. After the interview, which quickly spread across news channels and social media, the officers was overwhelmed by the wave of responses. Support poured in from all sides. People wrote him letters and messages, sharing their own stories filled with the pain and fear they had once faced. His heart clenched as he read messages from strangers who felt rejected and humiliated simply because of their skin color, background, or faith. This support was a huge emotional support for him, but with it came the realization of the depth and tragedy of what he was facing. People talked about how hatred and racism had turned their lives into a daily struggle to simply be themselves. Some told how they had faced bullying and ridicule as children, how colleagues sometimes looked at them with contempt or suspicion, and others, like him, had to fight for their lives and dignity. But among the many messages of support, there were other responses, ones that hit him deeper and more painful than the attacker's words. There were comments on social media from people who tried to justify the attacker, who argued that people like him had no right to hold office, no right to equality. These words were imbued with the very hatred he had already faced, and he felt them fueling the pain and frustration in his soul. "You've seen how many are in favor of us," one of his colleagues said, trying to support him. "Most people realize you've been through something terrible. We all know you were strong and got through it, and your story will help others." These words warned him, but the pain did not go away. The officers could not escape the thought that hatred was so deeply rooted in society that his experience was not just a personal tragedy, but part of a much bigger picture, part of a problem that affected everyone. He felt devastated, as if he were on the front lines of an invisible war that no one recognized, but in which everyone was involved. One day, he received a letter from a woman that particularly moved him. She wrote that her son, a boy about 10 years old, had witnessed his interview and afterwards asked her why someone could hate another person simply because of who they were born to be. She told how hard it was for her to explain this to her son, how difficult it was to convey to him the essence of that hatred so that he could understand that the world can be cruel. The officers felt the pain and sadness of this mother, her attempts to keep the light and goodness in her child's heart despite the darkness that sometimes seeped into their lives. He felt how important this struggle was, how important it was not just to survive, but to stand up, to hate so that her son's generation might not know what he knew. His ordeal, his pain had taken on new meaning. They had become part of something bigger than he could have imagined. Deep down, he realized that he had to continue, had to be part of this movement. He now knew that his story and his struggle had been an inspiration to many who had once felt similarly helpless and humiliated. With each passing day, the officers felt a profound reassessment of who he was and what he believed in. His service, which he had once considered his vocation, now seemed to him not just a profession, but something much more complex and requiring constant struggle. It had always seemed to him that his duty was to protect people, to maintain order and justice. But now he realized that the reality was much deeper. It was not just a job, but a confrontation with the darkness that lived in people and came out when he least wanted to see it. The internal struggle that began after the attack made him look at the world through different eyes. He could no longer just be an officer who does his job and goes home, leaving everything outside his doorstep. Now every incident, every act of aggression reminded him of the hatred he faced. He saw some people looking at him with respect and gratitude, as someone who had survived a terrible ordeal and stayed true to his mission. But there were also those who still did not accept him, who looked at him with distrust or disdain, as if he were an outsider they would rather not see in their society. Those glances, oh rare, were still like wounds to him, a reminder that hatred could be hidden behind a smile, behind a polite nod, behind a brief greeting. Now he saw the shadows that lurked in people and felt that his task had changed now. He was protecting not only order, but those who, like him, were victims of prejudice, victims of injustice. One day, while on patrol, he met an elderly man who recognized him from a story on the news. The man, barely able to move with the help of a cane, approached him, his face tense, but his gaze determined. "You know, I've been through a lot in my life," the old man said, "and when I saw what you've been through, I realized that you're fighting not only for yourself, but for all of us. We've all been humiliated at some point, some stronger, some weaker, but seeing how you stood up to that hatred and didn't break gave me hope." Those words pierced the officers. He realized that his story, his pain, had become more than just a memory of that night. It became a symbol for those who once felt helpless and vulnerable. He realized that every day when he put on his uniform, he was taking on the responsibility to not only protect himself, but to show the world that hate will not win. There is power in every human being to stand up to evil, no matter how powerful. The officers felt that his values were now stronger, that he had found new meaning in what he was doing. His fight against racism and hatred, against prejudice and evil, had become his new vocation. He now knew that he was not just a police officer, it was a symbol of resistance, a symbol of resilience and hope for those who had once felt just as defenseless. Several months had passed since the day the officers had been attacked, but the memory of that night remained in his mind like an unhealed wound. Every time he put on his uniform, he felt the weight of it much more than before. For him, it was no longer just clothing, it was a reminder of his duty and of the fact that there remained a darkness in the world he was protecting that was deeper than mere crime. The town was shaken by its history. It stirred discussions in the local community, in the press, and at town meetings. People came together to show support, share personal stories, discuss their fears and hopes for the future. But the more they talked about the need for unity, the clearer it became how entrenched racism was in the community. There were those who tried to diminish the importance of his story, who claimed that he was simply the victim of a random attack. That talk of hatred and prejudice only fueled hostility. The officers felt like every such statement was hitting his beliefs, trying to erase what he had experienced, what had deeply affected his soul. It seemed to him that these people were not just refusing to acknowledge his pain, they were trying to erase it as if it had never existed. This ignoring, this unwillingness to see the problem was almost as painful as the first blow he had received that night. He realized that this form of aggression, hidden under the veil of restraint, was no less destructive. One evening, he was speaking at a town hall community meeting to which he had been invited to speak about his experience and the importance of recognizing and addressing racism. He felt that his story could be not just a personal tragedy, but a cause for change. His voice trembled when he spoke because he knew it was not just about him, but about everyone who has faced similar hatred. "I stand here today not only as an officer, but as a person who has faced a reality that many prefer to remain silent about," he said. "The hatred that was directed at me does not come from one person. It is the result of the fact that we all as a society allow it to exist. We allow it to grow in the shadows until it becomes so strong that it breaks through." His words touched many people, but he also saw the detachment on some people's faces, the unwillingness to admit that there was a problem. He realized that change would be slow and painful, Racism and prejudice were not just the mistakes of individuals, but deep roots woven into the fabric of society. This struggle required time, effort, patience, and perhaps even sacrifice. The meeting ended, and as people began to disperse, a young woman approached him with a little girl holding her hand. The woman thanked him for his bravery and honesty, and her daughter, looking at him with genuine respect, whispered, "Thank you for protecting us." These simple words pierced his heart and reminded him that despite the darkness, despite the pain and hatred he had experienced, his fight was important. It is important for the future of these children, for the people who want to live in a world where everyone is valued, where no one feels like a stranger. The officers returned home that night feeling both tired and hopeful. He knew that racism was an enemy that would not disappear quickly, that aggression and hatred would still be encountered on his path. But he was ready to fight because he realized that every day he stood as a public guardian. Every action he took, every word he said, was a step in the fight to make the world a little brighter, to make less room for hate. Friends, this story evokes strong emotions, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Share in the comments how you feel about what happened. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How has it affected you and your perception of the world? Remember that each and every one of you is incredibly important to us. We appreciate each and every one of our viewers and your stories that help us discuss such important topics. Thank you for being with us. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories and discussions. We wish you a good day and peace in your heart.